Hurrem Sultan's journey was unlike any other. Born far from the opulence of Topkapi Palace, she was never meant to be a queen, at least, not by fate's ordinary design. Yet, against all odds, a girl from Ruthenia, captured and sold into slavery, would rise to become the most powerful woman in the Ottoman Empire. The world knew her as Hurrem, but history remembers her as the woman who rewrote the rules of power. When she first arrived in the imperial harem, she was just another concubine, one among hundreds, her future seemingly bound to the whims of palace intrigue. But Hurrem was different. She was not merely beautiful, she was intelligent, charming, and utterly captivating. Most concubines dreamed of catching the sultan's eye, of securing their place in the hierarchy of the harem. Hurrem, however, had a vision far greater. She would not just belong to the sultan, she would shape his reign. Her rise was nothing short of extraordinary. In a world where power belonged to men, she maneuvered through the silent corridors of influence, ensuring that her presence could never be ignored. She became the favorite of Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent, not just as a lover but as a confidant, an advisor, and ultimately, his wife, a status no concubine had held for over 2 centuries. But with power came enemies. The Ottoman court was a battlefield without swords, where words and alliances were the weapons of choice. Hurrem's influence threatened traditions, ignited rivalries, and left many questioning her true intentions. Was she a devoted wife who supported her husband's rule, or a master strategist orchestrating the downfall of those who stood in her way? One thing was certain: Hurrem Sultan was no ordinary woman. She defied expectations, redefined the role of women in the empire, and left behind a legacy that outlived her reign. But to understand her story, we must go back to where it all began, the moment she stepped into the palace, unknowingly setting into motion events that would change the course of history. When Hurrem first entered the harem, she was just another girl lost in a sea of silken whispers. The palace was a world of beauty and cruelty, where hundreds of women vied for a single glance from the sultan. Some were born into nobility, others were captured from faraway lands, but all shared one fate: serving the empire's ruler. For most, this was the end of their story. For Hurrem, it was only the beginning. She was unlike the rest. While others adorned themselves in lavish garments, Hurrem wielded charm and intelligence as her weapons. She laughed when others remained silent, spoke when others bowed, and carried herself with a confidence that turned heads. Soon, she caught the eye of Sultan Suleiman, a ruler known for his wisdom and strength. But catching his eye was not enough. Many had done so before, only to be forgotten. Hurrem's true power lay in what came next. She did not merely entertain the sultan, she fascinated him. Their conversations stretched beyond the night, from poetry to philosophy, from love to politics. She understood him in a way few could. She saw beyond the crown, beyond the power, and into the man himself. Suleiman found in her not just beauty, but companionship, an equal who challenged his mind and stirred his heart. For Mahidevran, Suleiman's first and longtime favorite, this was an insult too great to ignore. She had given him a son, Prince Mustafa, and held a position of power in the harem. But power in the palace was as fragile as glass, and Hurrem's presence cracked it. The rivalry between the two women was no secret, and tensions boiled over in whispered insults and veiled threats. The balance of the harem was shifting, and everyone knew it. Then came the moment that changed everything. Hurrem did the unthinkable. She bore a son for Suleiman and refused to acknowledge Mahidevran's superiority. This was more than defiance, it was a challenge to the very structure of the harem. A concubine could rise, but she could never overstep a favored consort. Hurrem shattered that rule. The sultan, instead of punishing her, rewarded her loyalty. But she did not stop there. Hurrem wanted more than just a place in the sultan's arms, she wanted permanence. She was not content with being a passing favorite, another name in history's forgotten corners. And so, in an unprecedented move, Sultan Suleiman did what no ruler had done for over 2 centuries, he married a concubine. The court was in shock. This was not tradition. A sultan's concubine was never meant to be his wife. The marriage elevated Hurrem beyond the harem, making her the legal empress of the empire. It was not just a love story, it was a statement of power. Hurrem had won a battle many believed impossible. Yet, her victory was just the beginning. The palace was no place for fairy tales. With her newfound status came new enemies, greater dangers, and challenges that would test the very limits of her ambition. As she stepped into this new role, she was no longer just the favorite, she was the most powerful woman in the Ottoman Empire, and she had no intention of letting that power slip away. Hurrem Sultan was no ordinary consort, she was a strategist, a tactician, and above all, a survivor. The moment she became Suleiman's wife, she understood that love alone would not secure her place in the empire. The Ottoman court was a battlefield, where loyalty was fleeting, and power was the only currency that mattered. Every move she made from that moment onward was calculated, not just to maintain her influence but to reshape the empire itself. Her rise had already shattered tradition. No concubine had ever become the legal wife of a sultan, and no harem woman had ever dared to interfere in matters of state. But Hurrem was different. She refused to be confined within the walls of the harem, pulling invisible strings that shaped the fate of the empire. She understood politics not just as a game of power but as an art of survival, where the slightest misstep could mean death. One of her greatest strengths was diplomacy. While most women of the harem remained in the shadows, Hurrem wrote letters to foreign rulers, including the Polish king and the Persian Shah. Her letters were not mere pleasantries, they were political tools, ensuring that alliances remained intact and that Suleiman's enemies knew the empire's strength extended beyond the battlefield. She softened tensions, negotiated agreements, and influenced decisions that shaped the course of history. But politics within the empire was far more treacherous than dealings with foreign rulers. The greatest threat to her position came from within the palace, Mahidevran and her son, Prince Mustafa. As the eldest son, Mustafa was the most obvious heir to the throne, loved by the people and respected by the army. His mother, Mahidevran, had once been Suleiman's favorite, and she still commanded influence in the court. Hurrem understood that as long as Mustafa lived, her own sons would remain secondary. The Ottoman tradition of fratricide meant that when a new sultan ascended the throne, his brothers were often executed to prevent civil war. If Mustafa became sultan, her sons would be in danger. And so, she played the long game, carefully weaving a web of influence that would ultimately determine the empire's future. She strengthened her alliance with Rustam Pasha, a brilliant statesman who would later become Grand Vizier. With his support, she ensured that the empire's key positions were filled with men loyal to her, creating an invisible network of power that extended from the palace to the military. Her influence over Suleiman only grew, and soon, whispers began to spread, whispers that Mustafa was too powerful, too independent, and perhaps, a threat to the throne. The execution of Ibrahim Pasha was the first real demonstration of her political skill. Ibrahim had been Suleiman's closest friend, his most trusted advisor, yet he had become too ambitious, too powerful. Hurrem saw the danger in allowing any man, other than the Sultan himself, to wield such influence. She did not act directly, but the court was a place where words carried more weight than swords. Over time, Ibrahim's missteps were magnified, his enemies emboldened, and his once unshakable position crumbled. When Suleiman finally ordered his execution, it was clear, no one, not even the most trusted man in the empire, was untouchable. But the greatest political battle of Hurrem's life was yet to come. Mustafa's popularity made him a serious contender for the throne, and even the slightest suggestion of disloyalty could be dangerous. Rumors began circulating. Was Mustafa conspiring with the army? Was he planning to overthrow his father? Whether the accusations were true or not no longer mattered. The court was a place where perception was reality, and once doubt took root in Suleiman's mind, there was no turning back. When Mustafa was summoned to his father's camp, he entered with the confidence of a prince who had spent his entire life preparing for the throne. But what awaited him was not a father's embrace, it was a death sentence. The execution of Prince Mustafa sent shockwaves through the empire. The people mourned him, the janissaries were enraged, but the throne was secure. With Mustafa gone, Hurrem's sons were now the only legitimate heirs. This was not just the victory of a mother securing her children's future, it was the triumph of a woman who had mastered the art of power in a world that sought to keep her silent. Hurrem had rewritten the rules of the Ottoman court, proving that influence was not confined to the battlefield or the vizier's chambers. Power could be wielded from the harem, through whispers, letters, and alliances forged in the shadows. Yet, every victory came at a cost. The court was forever changed, and Hurrem had made as many enemies as she had allies. The execution of Mustafa would haunt the empire for years to come, fueling the flames of rebellion and resentment. But Hurrem had secured her legacy. She was no longer just a concubine or a wife, she was the most powerful woman the Ottoman Empire had ever seen. Suleiman the Magnificent was the most powerful man in the world, yet even he was not immune to the forces of love, power, and betrayal that swirled around his court. The palace was a place where affection and ambition often blurred, where every smile concealed a hidden motive, and where the line between loyalty and treachery was dangerously thin. At the center of it all stood Hurrem Sultan, his beloved, his confidant, and the most enigmatic figure of his reign. But with power came enemies, and with love came dangerous consequences. The execution of Ibrahim Pasha had been a turning point. Ibrahim was not just a vizier, he was Suleiman's closest friend, a man who had once held enough influence to be seen as the empire's second ruler. His downfall had been swift, but it had not happened in isolation. The court whispered of Hurrem's hand in his demise, some called it revenge, others called it strategy. Either way, his death had sent a clear message: no one was untouchable. But one man's fall did not end the game of power. As long as Prince Mustafa lived, Hurrem's position remained precarious. Mustafa was the perfect heir, strong, capable, and beloved by the army. The Janissaries, the elite military force of the empire, saw him as the future of the Ottoman dynasty. The people revered him, and his mother, Mahidevran, still wielded influence. Hurrem knew that as long as Mustafa remained a contender for the throne, her sons were in danger. The Ottoman Empire had a brutal tradition. When a new sultan ascended, his brothers were often executed to prevent civil war. If Mustafa became sultan, would he spare his half-brothers? The answer was unlikely. The battle for the throne was not fought with swords alone, it was waged in whispers, in alliances, in the slow erosion of trust. Mustafa's greatest strength, his popularity, became his greatest weakness. He was too admired, too respected, and in an empire where absolute loyalty to the sultan was required, this made him a threat. Did he plot against his father? No one knows for sure. But it didn't matter. The suggestion alone was enough. Slowly, doubt seeped into Suleiman's mind. The weight of ruling an empire was immense, and betrayal was a constant shadow. Could he afford to ignore the possibility that his own son might one day rise against him? The fate of the empire depended on stability, and instability often came from within. The moment of reckoning arrived in 1553. Mustafa was summoned to his father's camp. The prince, confident in his innocence, entered the imperial tent without hesitation. But what awaited him was not a father's embrace, it was an executioner's noose. The Janissaries wept, the people mourned. The empire had lost its most promising heir. Some whispered that Hurrem had orchestrated it all, that she had fed Suleiman's paranoia, turning father against son. Was it true? Perhaps she had played a role, or perhaps Mustafa had simply been too powerful for his own good. What is certain is that with Mustafa gone, Hurrem's sons were now the only legitimate heirs. The future of the empire belonged to them. But the cost of that victory was immense. Suleiman, once the magnificent ruler of an expanding empire, now bore the weight of a father who had ordered his own son's death. He was never the same again. For Hurrem, the triumph was bittersweet. She had ensured the survival of her bloodline, but she had also rewritten the very structure of the Ottoman court. Never before had a woman wielded such influence, and never again would the harem remain a place of mere concubines. Hurrem had changed the game forever, proving that power was not confined to the battlefield or the vizier's chambers, it could be wielded from the shadows, with love as both a weapon and a shield. Hurrem Sultan had won the battle for power, but what she left behind was far greater than just political victories. She was not merely the wife of Sultan Suleiman, she had reshaped the very fabric of the Ottoman Empire. Where other women of the harem had been confined to the shadows, Hurrem had rewritten history, proving that intelligence, strategy, and influence could be just as powerful as the sword. Her legacy was not just one of power, but of transformation. One of the most enduring marks she left on the empire was her role in shifting the position of women in the Ottoman court. Before Hurrem, the harem was a place of silent figures, women who lived and died within its walls, never daring to interfere in matters of state. But Hurrem changed everything. She was the first woman to move out of the old palace after bearing the sultan's children, the first to live in Topkapi alongside the ruler, and most significantly, the first to be legally married to a sultan in over 200 years. This was more than just a personal triumph, it was a shift in the structure of the empire itself. After her, the role of the sultan's mother, the Valide Sultan, became one of the most powerful positions in the Ottoman hierarchy. The era that followed, known as the Sultanate of Women, saw queens and consorts exert influence in a way that had never been seen before. But Hurrem's legacy was not just political, it was also deeply cultural. Unlike many of her predecessors, she did not seek power simply for the sake of ruling. She understood that true immortality lay in what one built. While men left their mark through conquests, Hurrem left hers through charity, education, and architecture. She commissioned some of the most magnificent structures of her time, many of which still stand today. The Haseki Hurrem Sultan Mosque and the associated hospital and soup kitchen in Istanbul provided for the poor and the sick, ensuring that even those at the lowest levels of society felt the reach of imperial generosity. She built public bathhouses, ensuring that cleanliness and hygiene were accessible to all, and she funded religious schools, securing education for those who would otherwise have been left behind. Unlike rulers who built grand monuments to their own glory, Hurrem's projects were designed for the welfare of the people, testaments not just to her power, but to her vision. Yet, for all her triumphs, she remained one of the most controversial figures in Ottoman history. To her supporters, she was a woman of remarkable intelligence, a queen who reshaped the empire with her wisdom. To her enemies, she was a schemer, a manipulator who had removed all obstacles in her path, including the beloved Prince Mustafa and the mighty Ibrahim Pasha. Even centuries later, historians remain divided. Was she a cunning strategist who changed the course of history, or a woman who simply played the only game available to her and won? What cannot be disputed is the love she shared with Suleiman. Unlike the sultans before him, who moved from one concubine to another, Suleiman remained devoted to Hurrem for life. Their letters, filled with poetry and longing, show a love that endured despite the pressures of politics and power. In his words, she was his springtime, his joy, his beloved. In a world where queens were often forgotten after their deaths, Hurrem remained in the sultan's heart until his last breath. But she would not live to see the end of his reign. In 1558, after decades of holding the highest position any woman had ever reached in the Ottoman court, Hurrem Sultan passed away. She was buried in a magnificent mausoleum beside Suleiman's mosque in Istanbul, an honor rarely granted to a queen. Even in death, she remained by his side, a symbol of a love that defied tradition and a legacy that would outlive them both. Her influence did not end with her passing. The empire she helped shape continued to evolve in ways that bore her mark. The political power of the harem, the influence of the Valide Sultan, the era of powerful Ottoman queens, all of these stemmed from the doors she had forced open. Every woman who ruled from behind the scenes after her, every decision made by the mothers of sultans in the centuries that followed, carried the echoes of Hurrem's ambition and vision. In the end, Hurrem Sultan was more than just a concubine who became a queen. She was a force of nature, one who understood that power was not just about conquest, but about legacy. She did not wield a sword, yet she changed the empire more than most warriors ever could. And centuries later, her name still lingers, not just in the annals of history, but in the very stones of the city she helped shape. Hurrem Sultan was unlike any woman the Ottoman Empire had ever seen. She did not simply accept the role assigned to her, she redefined it. From a captured slave to the most powerful woman in the empire, she carved a path that no one before her had dared to walk. Where concubines were expected to fade into the background after bearing a sultan's child, she became his most trusted advisor. Where women of the harem were kept away from politics, she shaped the very course of the empire. Her story was one of ambition, intellect, and resilience. She played the game of power not with a sword, but with strategy and patience. The court was a battlefield, and she mastered it, outmaneuvering rivals and securing a future for herself and her children. Her influence stretched far beyond the palace walls. She advised on political matters, maintained diplomatic ties, and shaped policies that would leave a lasting impact on the empire. Yet, she was not without controversy. Her name became entangled with some of the most tragic events of Suleiman's reign. The fall of Ibrahim Pasha, the execution of Prince Mustafa, and the internal rivalries of the court all carried whispers of her involvement. Whether she orchestrated these events or simply survived them remains a debate among historians. But one thing is certain, she was at the heart of the Ottoman court's most defining moments. Beyond power and politics, Hurrem left behind a legacy of generosity and vision. The mosques, hospitals, and schools she built stood as monuments to her commitment to the people. While many rulers were remembered for their conquests, she was remembered for her contributions to society. Her charitable works ensured that her name lived on not just in the history books, but in the lives of those she helped. When she passed away in 1558, she left behind an empire that had been permanently altered by her presence. Suleiman, the greatest ruler of the Ottomans, had loved only one woman in his lifetime, and she had shaped his reign in ways no one could have foreseen. Even in death, she remained by his side, buried in a grand mausoleum next to his mosque, an honor no other sultana had received before her. Hurrem Sultan was more than just a queen. She was a visionary, a strategist, and a woman who dared to defy tradition. She was a ruler in all but title, and her influence endured long after she was gone. In the annals of history, there have been many powerful women, but none quite like Hurrem Sultan.